Okay, it is 10 a.m. here on the East Coast in the US, so we'll go ahead and start our webinar. It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone today to today's webinar. We're going to have a Q&A session about DSpace version 8.0. My name is Holger Lenz. I am the DSpace coordinator for working at Lyrasis. I'll be one of the presenters today, together with my colleague Tim Donohue, who is the DSpace technical lead. We want to welcome you very much to our webinar. We look forward to answering any questions you might have about DSpace 8. You can go to the next slide, Tim. Okay. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. For those of you who would like to hear this in Spanish, we have a live Spanish interpretation. So there is a button in your Zoom taskbar at the bottom that says interpretation. So if you click on that, you can choose between hearing the English channel or the Spanish channel. So a big thank you at this point also to our translator, Roxana, for providing the Spanish translation for us today. The questions that we will be going through today, most of those were collected before the webinar in the Google Doc with the URL that's posted here. Now, you cannot click on any of the links, just a small note, during the presentation. We will make the slides all available after the presentation today, after the Q&A session, via email. So if you want to then later go through all the links, you can. But if you want to open this document here with this bit.ly URL 2024-DSpace 8-QA, feel free to do so. That's where we're going to pull the questions from, and also then our answers will be pasted in that document for reference for everyone later on. So if you want to go back at any point, you can look at that document and see what the answer was to that question that was mentioned in this document. At this point, we have now closed the editing rights for this document. So if you have any questions that come up during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. That's also in your taskbar at the bottom. You see a small Q&A icon, and you can use that to ask any questions that might come up during the webinar. And then finally, our final housekeeping item, we're also recording this presentation. So the recording will be made available later on. And like I said earlier, also the slides that we're showing right now will be made available for you to review. So what are we going to talk about today? Here's just a brief overview of the structure of today's webinar. I will start off with a presentation about DSpace, about the global community, how you can get involved in the global community. Tim Donohue will be talking about the highlights and just give a brief overview of version 8.0. And then we'll have the main part of today's webinar available for the question and answer section. I've indicated some of the times here, more or less. That's the structure, what we're planning to do. So we want to use the main part for today's webinar to really see that any questions you might have are answered. If there are questions that are not answered, because of time, we will answer those in that Google document that I mentioned earlier. So we want to make sure that all of your questions will get answered. So please feel free, if you have any questions that come up during this webinar, to post them in our Q&A feature here in Zoom. Go to the next slide. Okay. So about DSpace, just a little bit. Most of you probably know what DSpace is. Maybe you're using DSpace at your institution, but just give a very brief overview. DSpace is the most widely adopted institutional repository in the world. We have about 40% of all institutional repositories in the world are DSpace installations. And the unique thing about DSpace is it is open source, and therefore it's not just a software, but it's really a global community. So the global users and members of DSpace are the ones who are trying to, or who are working on the development of DSpace. We have developers and committers who program the code for DSpace, for the software. We have global community events. We have user groups, national user groups in the global community that organize events to talk about DSpace and to see how DSpace is being used in their institution or their country. So there's a global community of exchange that happens with DSpace. So that's why we say it's not just a software, and it evolves with its users. And the organizational home of DSpace is Lyrasis. So both Tim and I, we work for Lyrasis. However, Lyrasis is not the owner of DSpace. Sometimes there's a bit of confusion. Lyrasis is the organizational home. That means Lyrasis provides the legal structure and the structure in general so DSpace can run. But the owner of DSpace really is the global community. And the global community are the ones who have the voice in developing DSpace and in deciding how to move forward with the development of DSpace. So just a few highlights from the DSpace community. As you can see here from this slide, we have over 3,500 registered installations worldwide. And they are all over the world. We see here the distribution on the map. We have installations in North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, Oceania. So all kinds of regions and countries are using DSpace, over 120. And we have 109 member institutions. And I'll talk in a minute about what that means. So we can go to the next slide. Before I talk about membership, just a few different ways about how you can get engaged and participate in DSpace. I just mentioned that DSpace is really a global community of users. So what does that mean and how can you get engaged and involved? We currently have 22 national user groups. And these national user groups, they provide an opportunity. They provide a platform for engagement, for discussions, for exchange. You can find on Slack channels for a number of these user groups. If you search for the hashtag DSpace and then with a dash and then a country, for example, we have DSpace Peru for the Peruvian National User Group. We have DSpace, DACH for the German-speaking community. We have DSpace Hispanohablante for those who speak Spanish and are interested in exchanging that way. So this is one of the ways that you can get involved in those national user groups through a Slack channel. We also have wiki pages on our DSpace wiki for the national user groups where they often list activities or events that are happening. For example, we have in the North American National User Group, we have a meeting coming up in September that will be happening in Minneapolis. So that's an opportunity for the North American user groups members to connect. And you can find more information about how to connect with your user group on the wiki pages. Another great way of connecting with the DSpace community is through the mailing lists. If you're not already on the mailing lists, we recommend you to join those. We have two main mailing lists that are available. The DSpace community mailing list has about 3,000 members, and that's an opportunity to share news or just to engage in discussion about DSpace. Also, community events are posted there. And then the DSpace tech list is more of a technical support list where you can ask questions about your installation of DSpace, any errors or trouble that you run into while you install DSpace, and you can get help that way if you need help for your installation. Like I said, we also have national webinars. We have events. I have some of those listed here in the section where you see the different dates, 2024, 2023. We have the North American User Group meeting that's coming up that I mentioned. We have a workshop in India that's coming up in August. We have today's DSpace 8 webinar. DSpace was also heavily presented on at the Open Repositories Conference in June. So this just gives you a little bit of a taste of what's happening worldwide in the global community and how you can get involved. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. Another way to get involved is through membership. So I'll briefly just talk about membership. What is membership? So institutions that support DSpace financially become DSpace members. And you can see here on this chart, there are different levels of membership, all the way going from supporter, starting at $500, all the way to platinum with $20,000 annually contributions. And this is a great way to support DSpace, because like we said earlier, DSpace is open source. Lyrasis is a nonprofit organization, so it does not support DSpace financially. The contributions to DSpace come from the community, and that's how DSpace can be developed further. That's how we can make improvements, add new features, feature requests that come from users. That's really your opportunity to get involved and support DSpace. And it's also an opportunity to get involved to lead the global community, because with contributions, financial contributions, come the opportunity to get involved in DSpace governance. So each year we run elections for DSpace governance, and those that are on DSpace governance, the leadership group, the steering group, are the ones who then can decide and have a voice in pushing forward the development, which features are added, and agreeing upon where DSpace is going to go and how it's going to be developed. So a membership really is a great way to get involved. And we understand not each institution, of course, can contribute the same amount. But we just saw on the previous slide that there are about 3,500 known installations. Now, if each institution just were to contribute $100, if you do the math, that adds up to quite a bit. So where it doesn't have to be, a lot, but each contribution helps, and we really appreciate each contribution that comes from institutions around the world. Another way to get involved is through the DSpace Development Fund. So the DSpace Development Fund is a recent initiative that we started. And the difference between the Development Fund and the membership is that the Development Fund is a one-time contribution. So if you just want to contribute a one-time fund, you can do that through the Development Fund, and you can take a look at that later on. It's linked here in the slide deck. So if you want to, once we send out the slide deck, if you want to look at that, you can. And the Development Fund usually is dedicated towards a certain goal in development. So for example, in the last year, fiscal year, we used the money for Development Fund, contributed that to accessibility audits and remediation. So anything that had to do with accessibility is being addressed through the funds that come in from the DSpace Development Fund. And last but not least, I also wanted to mention the DSpace service providers. So service providers are for-profit institutions that provide services on DSpace. For example, they provide hosting. And just like with membership, we also have different tiers for the service providers. We have a platinum tier, and they contribute a value of over $50,000 annually to the program, either financially or in kind. We also have gold service providers, and we have silver service providers. And as you can see here, the platinum service providers, it mentions here that they are certified. So certified service providers are the ones that provide work in connection with the development fund. So any funds that are going to the development fund, that is reserved for the work that certified service providers do for DSpace. Okay, that concludes just the very brief presentation on just the general membership, the community. So I want to hand over the microphone now to my colleague Tim Donohue, who is going to give an overview over DSpace version 8.
Thank you, Holger. And I did want to note, while I'm going through this overview, if you do have questions that come up, just a reminder to go ahead and use that Q&A feature. That way we have questions already ready to go as we get to the Q&A portion. And if I notice anything that pops into that Q&A area while I'm talking that's related to what I'm talking about, I might answer it as we go, depending on what the easiest way to do things are. But I just want to remind folks that the Q&A function is there, and I see a couple questions have already popped in there as well. And we'll get to those as we go along. But to start off with, I wanted to give everyone an 8.0 overview, talk a little bit about the features of DSpace 8 and how those features were decided upon, and then answer a couple commonly asked questions that I see on mailing lists, just in case folks may have those questions here as well. They're things we hear a lot, so I'll be getting to those near the end of this, and then we'll open things up to all of your other questions that are either on that Google Doc, as Holger mentioned, or in the Q&A chat. So we'll do both of that. So starting with the DSpace 8.0 overview, I wanted to start with how the priorities are set for any release. 8.0, just like the upcoming prioritization for 9.0, was prioritized by our steering group. 8.0 had a shortened development cycle, and it was planned right after the 7.6 release, which meant there was less than a year between the 7.6 release and 8.0. So steering established 4 high-level priorities for this release, which are listed here. And based on those priorities, volunteer or donated development actions, or even some that could be paid for through the development fund, based on those priorities, though, the development happens in a much more volunteer-based effort. So the features that are listed underneath these priorities were not identified directly by steering, but were actually donated back from various community institutions or developers and aligned with the priorities that were set by steering. And that is how development tends to occur with DSpace. We do not have a centralized development team. As Holger mentioned, that development happens from the community. And steering's role is to just set the priorities and give scope around what priorities we want to achieve within this next major release. So for 8.0, I'll briefly go through the priorities here. We're allowing anything in and helping finish up anything that just missed the 7.x releases. There were 4 features that fell into that category, and they all made it into 8, and they're listed at the bottom. I'll go into those in more detail. I'm allowing any new features that can empower users, especially admin features. Allowing any features that were in older releases, like DSpace 6, that did not make it into DSpace 7. So this is a continuation of making sure that everything in the newer platform, or everything in the older platform, has been migrated over to the newer platform. And then finally, a category that is always there with every release, really, just bug fixes, accessibility fixes, performance improvements, dependency upgrades. Those are always a priority for us with every release. But these are the 4 high-level categories that steering set for us in planning out this release. And quickly jumping to what the result was out of this, it's worth noting that 8.0 is a much smaller release than any of the DSpace 7 work, because in DSpace 7, we were really rebuilding a platform, but it was still a significant release in itself. So there were a lot of new features, which we'll be going through here, some of them that came out of this release. But the thing that was really exciting for me out of it is that we actually had more individuals, more volunteers contributing code to 8.0 than we did during the 7.0 development. That points to me that people are learning the platform, getting more familiar, wanting to dig in and give at least small bug fixes back. And the more contributors we can have at that level, even with small bug fixes, the quicker we're all able to move together. Also, out of all the features that were donated back based on those prioritizations, a theme sort of started to arise. And this was not necessarily a purposeful theme, though it does align really well with things that steering is talking about and things that steering prioritized out of the 8.0 release cycle. But the theme that came out of DSpace 8 is that in the end, this release became really about enhanced interoperability, finding ways that DSpace can communicate better with other services and systems that are external from itself, or even with other DSpace repositories. And there's several features that came out of that that I want to highlight here in a little more detail that are listed here, but we'll go into them one by one. I did want to note these all sort of align towards FAIR best practices. And if you're not familiar with FAIR, it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. You can look at that online, and I think there also is a link here embedded within this slide if you want to learn more about those FAIR best practices. But DSpace 8 was bringing DSpace more into those best practices in ways that we hadn't achieved before. And we'll talk about a couple of those ways right now. One of those ways was with publication claim. This is a new feature that automatically imports a user's publications from external systems. And initially, this is only with OpenAir Graph. There's the opportunity to add additional systems here that can support this sort of feature, but it was built towards OpenAir Graph because they provide this feature via their own APIs. But the idea here is that a researcher would log into DSpace. This service would run and automatically find as many publications as it can that may be authored by that researcher or that researcher might have been a part of, and present that list to the researcher. This gives the researcher the opportunity then to just easily review the list, confirm whether or not they were an author of that publication, and if so, they can import that directly into DSpace without a whole lot of work on their end. It is worth noting that this feature and several other these integration features do rely heavily on the default configurable entities that are in DSpace. They're disabled by default, but they're very easy to enable. And several of these features rely on those, as well as this researcher profile feature, which existed in DSpace 7. But an example of how publication claim works in the user interface is that if you're a user logging in, a researcher logging in, you might see a notification like this that will pop up on your My DSpace page, or as you're going through, or right after you log into the system. You'll see a notification that we've found a certain number of publications in OpenAir Graph that might have been authored by you, and you have the opportunity to then review them. If you go to the review page, you'll see a list like this, where you see a list of publications that may or may not have been authored by you, but it's the best guess based on the information DSpace knows about you. Things like your ORCID ID if it's in the system, or even just your first and last name, or different alternatives to that, or your dates of publication, or likely publication if you put in information about your dates of work or dates of birth within DSpace. But what you see is a list there of publications that may have been authored by you, and you can go through this easily, either in bulk or one by one, to approve and import them immediately, or say, this isn't mine, in which case the system will ignore that one and not recommend it in the future. And there is a total score here as to how certain DSpace thinks this may be authored by you, to give you an indication of whether or not that is likely to be yours, and kind of order them in that fashion. There's also a way to do this for administrators. So if an admin logs into the system, they can also do publication claim on behalf of the researchers within the system. So it doesn't have to be each researcher doing it themselves, but an admin can go in and review these on behalf of the researchers, and note which ones are definitely that researcher and which ones may not be, based on what they know as well. Another similar sort of integration feature, and again relates to OpenAir, is called data correction. And in DSpace, this is in the DSpace user interface, it's called quality assurance. So it's literally trying to enhance the data in DSpace about the items and publications that are in DSpace. Initially, this is primarily through OpenAir, but there's one feature I'll note that is DSpace sort of DSpace users submitting data corrections back to DSpace as well. But the example from the OpenAir perspective is an administrator can log in, and this data correction service will notify that administrator of information that may be missing from publications that are already within DSpace. So it could be missing metadata or incorrect metadata. It could be other related entities to those publications or any updates that OpenAir may understand based on what is already in DSpace. And similar to that last feature, the administrator can review them and either accept or ignore each suggestion. And this is very similar in that it relies on entities and researcher profile. The one difference here is that this is a service from OpenAir that requires you to be registered as an OpenAir provider. So it's not necessarily going to be available to all DSpace users out of the box, but if you are an OpenAir provider, you can utilize this. An example of how this looks is because this is an admin feature, it's not quite as smooth or clean perhaps as some of the end user features, but you'll see topics here in terms of what sort of information OpenAir knows about the publications in DSpace, in your DSpace. And so these topics are somewhat straightforward to kind of read through here. So you have enrich missing abstracts. So these are publications that may have an abstract that are missing that OpenAir knows about and can send you the abstract. There's information about PIDs, so identifiers, whether they're missing or maybe there's additional identifiers that some publications may be missing. And there's also the ability to click on adding more projects to the system where it's found OpenAir has found a project that is related to a publication, and maybe you want to import that into your DSpace to make that relationship known within DSpace. So in this example, if we clicked on that more project, this is sort of an example of what you might see. You'll see the publication that was within DSpace already, along with the project details that OpenAir is aware of that it thinks are related to this publication. And you have the option there to either accept that, in which case DSpace will import that new project. And remember, project is an entity within DSpace, and it'll link it up to that publication entity. So you'll have both of those within your DSpace system. If you find this isn't related, you can also have the opportunity to reject it here on this screen as well. If you did select, or this is the next feature. If you did actually import it here from this point of view, that linkage would happen immediately there with the project data being linked up to the publication data. And I forgot my next slide is on the next area of data correction. So the other type of data correction is where DSpace users can send basic notifications back to administrators now in DSpace 8. And this does not require any integration with OpenAir. It's built into DSpace itself. And right now, the main type of notification they can send is a request to withdrawal or a request to reinstate. So as a DSpace user, if they stumble on something that they know should not be in that DSpace instance, or maybe they were the author and they wish to withdraw this, they can ask the admin, please withdraw this, and give them a reason. They have to give a reason as to why that withdrawal request has been made. So there's a button now in the interface that allows users to achieve this. Similarly, if something is already withdrawn and the user may have been the one who submitted it, they can request to have it reinstated for whatever reason they may have. And again, they have to provide a reason back to the administrator. And these reasons are sent back to the administrator in the same way that those other sort of data correction services were coming from OpenAir. The administrator will see these requests withdrawn in this situation of things that people have requested to be withdrawn, and they can then look at that publication and decide whether to accept it, in which case it's withdrawn immediately, or reject it, in which case the publication is left as is. And the same goes with the request for reinstatement. This is one other example here of how this is viewable within the user interface. Administrators can also see that there are pending requests from the My DSpace. So if they don't notice them on login, they'll get a notification in their My DSpace area to let them be aware that they should go check on these and make sure that they can answer these requests. Another major integration feature out of DSpace 8 is the core notify protocol. I'm not going to go through this in great detail as to what the protocol is, but it's basically a very basic way to send notifications between repository systems and relevant services. And those notifications are sent via the linked data notification protocol, or LDN. We're not going to go into details to what those notifications look like technologically, However, I'll show what they look like in the user interface here briefly. And a couple examples of and user needs or use cases for this. So one example of how this might be used is there's an external system called PCI, the Peer Community in Service. And this is a recommendation system and a peer review system that can be used external from DSpace or external from any repository. But it also supports Core Notify, and DSpace 8 does as well. So now DSpace users can actually make requests to PCI and say, can you review this? That community can respond back and say, yes, they'll review it, or no, they will not. At which point, if they say yes, the review is conducted entirely within PCI. They do their own review processes there. And once that review is complete, they can send that data back to DSpace so that DSpace can store a link to the review in the metadata and link back to where that review exists in PCI. Additionally, PCI also offers the ability to endorse a paper from their community. They can send those endorsements back to DSpace as well, and DSpace will capture that endorsement in a link to the metadata. And this is all controlled via these lightweight notifications that are occurring via Core Notify. Another basic example is with the Dataverse project that can be used to store data sets. So if you submit something into DSpace and you link to a data set that is already within Dataverse, then the DSpace has this message consumer inside it. It will be checking for those links occasionally. When it finds a link to a data set that's in Dataverse, DSpace can send a notification off to Dataverse to say, I have a publication that uses one of these data sets, and Dataverse can capture that and link back to the item in that DSpace instance. The same can be true in the other direction. Dataverse can also say, I have a data set that links back to one of your publications, and send that note back to DSpace so that DSpace can capture that link as well. It is worth noting that with Core Notify, you have to register which services you want to work with. That's all done from the admin user interface. This is just a basic screenshot of what that looks like. So out of the box, it's not going to start sending notifications off to PCI or Dataverse. You would have to configure that and configure the connection for that to tell DSpace, this is what I want to be sending notifications to, and also what I want to accept notifications from. When you see those notifications, they show up similar to some of those other notifications I showed earlier. You'll see them in sort of the upper area of either items they're related to, or even in your My DSpace page, where you'll be notified about basic information coming back from Core Notify. And at the admin level, they have the ability to look at these notifications in bulk, as well as look at logs that are coming in and out of the system based on these notifications. And that's what this screen identifies. And each of these various boxes here can be clicked on so you can see what all 11 of them were accepted and which ones have failed, and even try and rerun some of the ones that failed if necessary. I'm going to go on to a couple other features real quick here, and I want to wrap up soon so I can get to your questions. And I do have some common questions we'll get to in a second. But a few other features to be aware of in DSpace 8 is there's a new research organization registry integration that allows you to import org unit entities. So if you wanted to add a new organizational unit, you can, using the DSpace interface, search through ROR and do an import directly from ROR, all within DSpace. When you import something from ROR, it'll actually capture that ROR identifier that will then allow that organizational unit to link back to its record in ROR. And so this allows you to, again, integrate in with an external system in a much cleaner fashion than before. Few other features to note. This one existed back in DSpace 6. So it's not a brand new feature, but it's a brand new to DSpace 8. It did not exist in DSpace 7. So it allows you the ability to mark which file is the primary file within a particular item. And when you do that, that file is what will be used both for the thumbnail as well as it will have an identification on the item page that marks it as the primary one so that users know which file to download if there's a large number that are listed under a particular item. DSpace 8 also has redesigned the processes page that came first in DSpace 7. So as a reminder, these are scripts that can be run either from the admin UI or on they can also be run from the command line, some of these scripts, although they won't always appear in the processes overview in that scenario. But now in DSpace 8, these processes are grouped based on whether they're running, scheduled, succeeded, or failed. And you can click within a group then to see all the processes that fall within that category in order to see their results in more detail, as well as delete that entry if you no longer want to keep it around in the system. There's also a new basic duplicate detection option within the submission user interface, and this also works for workflow. So the purpose here is just to prevent duplicate items from being added into your DSpace instance. So when you're submitting something into DSpace, as you enter in the metadata and save the metadata, if there's a similar title already in the system, then you'll see a notification like this within the submission form listing any potential duplicates that are already there so you can review those and stop your submission right there if you realized it is a duplicate. The same also appears in the workflow approval process for people who are doing workflow approval tasks. They may see notifications at times about potential duplicates. We also have search in a few extra places. So you can see there's a new search tab on community and collection pages. That's on the left there. And by default, this search tab will show the most recently added items in that community or collection. But it also allows you the ability to search quickly within that community or collection. And optionally, you can enable discover information on the home page, which is shown on the right there. And that's a new set of filters that will allow you to jump immediately to searches of those types on the community homepage. There's a lot more features that I'm not going to get into here today. The 8.0 release notes has all the features, but this is a very featureful list or release, I'm sorry, a very featureful release. These are a couple other major features that I'm not going to talk through today, as well as some major updates. And there were over 300 bug fixes in this release, all of which were backported to 7.6.2, which was our bug fix release that came out shortly after 8.0. So that's really my overview for 8.0. At this point in time, I'm going to transition into a couple common questions I've heard on mailing lists, and then we're going to get into your other questions, both in the chat and in the Google Doc. So I wanted to take a moment here just to answer things that come up very commonly, both with the upgrading process as well as just general questions that appear frequently either in Slack or mailing lists or other locations. So these are tips, but they're also questions that I see frequently. So can I upgrade from any prior version of DSpace? Yes, is always the answer here. This does come up more frequently than you may expect, but we always support the ability to upgrade your data and which is your metadata in your files automatically. You may need to customize or recustomize your user interface depending on the type of upgrade you're doing here, because especially with major upgrades, there can be major changes in the user interface. But I did want to note here that DSpace 8 is very similar to DSpace 7, but it has a lot of new features. So it's worth being aware of what those new features are and looking at the release notes around that. Similar or along those lines, things to be aware of before you upgrade is we have a brand new breaking changes section in the release notes. This is meant to call out things that the developers feel might impact people when you're upgrading. So they're things that have a high likelihood of impacting your upgrade that you need to be aware of before you do the upgrade. A few of those examples that came out of the upgrade between 7 and 8 is that the front end is now running on Angular 17. So if you've highly customized your front end and added new Angular components, you'll need to make sure that those are compatible with Angular 17 because Angular 17 now requires standalone components. That's something that is at the Angular level. It's not difficult, but it's something you need to be aware of. The backend also now requires later versions of Tomcat. So if you've made major changes there, you need to be aware that there's some major dependency upgrades there on the Java level, specifically Jakarta EE support. And it is also worth noting that now the backend can be run using a runnable jar. So you do not even need to install Tomcat anymore. DSpace can run via this runnable jar, which has embedded Tomcat within it. And it just runs the latest version of Tomcat available at that point in time. And so this is a nice, clean way that you might want to consider running the backend as you upgrade. But there's more things in that breaking changes section. These are just a few that I think most people will want to be aware of. There are other notes in there about things that have either gone away in terms of features or new things that may impact your upgrade that you just need to be aware of there. And if you ever notice anything not listed there that you think we should list there, this is an area that I should say we love feedback in terms of documentation and improvements there. And that's an area that the documentation is built by the community and maintained by the community. So please make suggestions if you notice something missing from that area. I also want to briefly note there are two ways to upgrade. This comes up a lot on the mailing list as well. These can be used in any scenario, but there's the install over top of your current release, which is the normal upgrade process, and that's great for minor upgrades. It also can be great for major upgrades, but in some scenarios, you just need to make sure you're updating your dependencies and being careful about looking at the release notes. But it is worth noting there's also a migration option that allows you to just install the fresh release, the brand new release, and migrate your data over. And this can be easier for major upgrades, especially between the 6 and 7 upgrade. That I would recommend more than the upgrade process, just because it's a little bit easier to get 7 running initially on its own and then migrate your data over into that from 6. So it's something worth considering. They both end with the same result. So what one you choose is really up to you. And this comes up as well as to whether configurable entities are required. They're not required, but there are more and more features built on top of them. So you need to be aware of what features require you to install those default entities. And these are the 4 that I'm aware of at this point in time. It is worth being aware of the notes at the bottom. Even when entities are enabled, you're still able to use regular items. You don't have to use publications at all times. It's not a requirement with entities turned on. You can still use all the regular items you want, but it does enable other features, and you do have to use entities for these specific features to work. And it's also worth noting the AIP backup and restore is still built more around regular items, and we're working on getting better support for entities into that, but it's not quite there at this point in time. So if that's something you use frequently, then you may want to be aware of that. This is a common thing that you'll see me posting on mailing lists a lot. So we get a lot of good support questions on mailing lists, and people are following the support guide as to where to ask their questions. But what not everybody necessarily notices is we do have a troubleshooting guide that can help you dig a little bit deeper if something weird is going on in the user interface, or you see a really vague error message in the user interface. This troubleshooting guide is where to start, and it's where to go to see if you can find the underlying error message that may be underneath the user interface or underneath the backend in the logs. That message, that underneath message, is really what the developers need to help you solve your problem. And oftentimes, if you're just freshly installing DSpace 7 or 8, the error message you find there using the troubleshooting guide might be listed in the common installation issues, which is linked here at the bottom. These are issues we see people run into all the time, and we've documented how to solve them. So this is a quick way to help yourself. If you can find that message yourself and look in the common installation issues, you might be able to get a solution there quicker than you could by posting on the mailing list. And quickly, to get to the questions here, future releases coming up here and what's coming up next. 9.0 is in the planning stage right now, coming out approximately in April of next year. There will be bug fix releases to both 8, so 8.1 and 7.6.3. So it'll be another 7.6 release. Those are yet to be determined as to when those will occur. I suspect they'll probably be out sometime in 2024, just based on how frequently we do bug fix releases, but I don't know for certain. It's based on when we have enough bugs that we want to push out to the community, or bug fixes that we want to push out to the community. But those releases will not have new features in them. The next new features will be in 9.0. And alluding back to what Holger had noted earlier, and before we get to the questions here, um, I want to note again that we are a volunteer-based development process. Everything we do is volunteer-based. The steering group's volunteer-based. We do have the small group of members are small based on our community size, but everything we do is volunteer-based and owned by the community. So it really is a collective responsibility for all of us. You all are part of that community, and you can help out on mailing lists, in development processes, and all those different ways. I listed a couple ways here that are both non-technical and technical on the next slide of how you can get better involved. Holger already talked about membership in the development fund. There's also the opportunity for non-developers to get involved in DCAT. That's our community advisory team, and they talk about common DSpace issues they may be running into, or tips and tricks on how to use DSpace better. They bring feedback back to developers and steering on upcoming work. I also know they're about to embark on a user experience testing of the DSpace demo site. So they're getting ready to look into that to try and provide some feedback back on user experience. But they're a great group to get involved with. You can also help out on mailing lists or Slack. If you know the answer to a question there, please post it. Or if you think you know the answer, please post it, because it might help others also chime in there on that particular answer and make sure that we get the right answer to the person who asked the question. The documentation is also community-based. So if you notice gaps in the documentation or want to help us document the user experience better, or how to do things in the DSpace user interface, then please contribute there, because we'd love to have improvements of that sort. There's also DSpace user groups, which Holger mentioned earlier as well. From a technical perspective, we have a guide for testing pull requests now on how you can help out in testing. And this is a big gap for us right now. We get a lot of good development coming in, but we don't have as many people testing the tiny bug fixes. If that's of interest to you, please take a look at this guide or help us improve it so we can get more people involved there. Anyone can do code reviews. Anyone can claim tickets and contribute code. Anyone can also join our weekly developer meetings where we talk about what's coming next and brainstorm next steps, or talk about big problems everybody is hitting and how to solve them. And again, this is an area that I would reference. We could use your help on mailing lists, Slack, or in documentation to chip in there and help answer other people's questions. Okay, so I know I'm over time by quite a bit. I got some of the common questions there answered, and now we're going to go to the questions that are in the Q&A as well as in the Google Doc here. I've been seeing that there's quite a few coming in the Q&A. I'm going to try and start with the Google Doc, but I think that that some of these are a little bit more straightforward in the Google Doc, and we can jump to the Q&A here shortly. And I welcome Holger. You can jump in here to kind of pull in questions as you see similar questions coming up as needed. But I wanted to start here, and let me kind of bump this up a little so we can see this a little better. As you can see, I am typing answers already into the document. Everything will eventually get typed into the document to have a relevant link. But I've already answered several of these that have come up. So the ROR integration we talked about already, and I showed a demo of how this works. I did see there was a question in the chat related to ROR. Is it possible to link and match existing org units to ROR records if available? I believe that is possible. However, it might need to be done more manually, where you have to add the metadata field that DSpace is using for that linkage, because really all it is it's storing that link in a metadata field. That's all that link is. So if that metadata field exists, then that link back to ROR should exist. And I believe that's the case. but I'm sure another developer will correct me if I'm wrong on that particular one. Um, so that's the ROR question. There's a lot of questions about entities, I will note. I know there's a lot in the chat. There's also a lot in the Google Doc. I did want to note here, first off, related to entities, while I know them well, I'm finding, and this is all to you all being on top of things very well, I'm finding that people are asking more and more complex questions on entities that I don't know the answer to off the top of my head. But the good news is that with the Q&A document here, I was able to dig in to some of these to find the answers. I cannot promise that I can do the same thing live for everything in the Q&A, but I'll do my best as we're going through here. But I'm going to go through several of the entities questions first on the Google Doc, just to see if that helps clarify things in other people's minds. So there's this question about removing entities and relationships. Right now, this is not possible through the admin user interface. You'd have to do this at the database level. And this is one of the reasons why entities are still more of an advanced feature. They're disabled by default. And we do that purposely because there are some things with entities that are a little bit clunky, for lack of a better word, or hard, difficult to work with at times. And this is one of them. It's not very easy to remove entity types that already exist in the system or remove new relationship definitions. And I got to be clear here, you can remove entities, individual entities. What this question is asking is, can you remove an entity type? So can I remove the person entity type? Or can I remove the person to org unit relationship type? And that's the thing that's more difficult to remove. You can remove the individual entities easily, but the actual definition of those entities is difficult to remove. And similarly, when you're adding new relationships, that are completely custom on the item page. That's what this question has to do with. Uh, this is a little bit more complex right now. And right now, I'm not sure what's going on with this particular user. There's a very detailed ticket here that I'm going to have to get back to later. I didn't have enough time to dig into this, but it's more complex right now to add all these features, all these custom entities into the system because you may need to modify some of the user interfaces based on how you are defining those custom entities. And some of that comes up here in some of these later questions. And I'm going to skip over these two and get back to these in a second because I want to tackle a couple entities questions together. I think these are somewhat related, and a lot of them have to do with um, adding custom entity types. So defining your own entities or defining your own relationships. So this one relates to, can I have the same sort of relationship defined that can link together different types of entities? So can I have a person and organization linked to a publication using the same relationship? And the basic answer here is yes. We already have an example for that in the system. DSpace has an is author of publication relationship that you can use when you enable entities. And in this case, the author object here can be either a person or an org unit. Either one can be linked to the publication. However, I did notice in looking into this that there was a bug with this in earlier releases of 7. So I think there was a bug that was just fixed in 7.6.2 and 8 to allow this to work more appropriately. So for folks who are working with custom entities, you really might want to upgrade to the latest version of DSpace to see if that solves some of the issues you're running into, because we found some bugs along the way that have been solved in these more recent releases. And similarly, this is the same sort of thing where you're defining a brand new relationship type between org units. You want to relate an org unit back to an org unit. And it should be possible. It's not defined out of the box where you could do something like this, where you have an org unit related to an org unit, and one is the parent and one is the child. I've not tested this myself, but from what I'm looking at in the code, this looks possible. However, similar to that last one, there was a bug related to this where someone else had tried the same thing on earlier versions of 7 and found it wasn't working properly. That was fixed in 7.6.2 and in 8.0. So similarly here, I'd recommend upgrading and trying this again, but I believe it is now possible to relate an entity back to its same type. So the left type and the right type are the exact same in that scenario. So that should be possible now with custom entities. Another entity one, I'm skipping down through the entity ones here, kind of purposely to group things together. Um, this is related to metadata fields defined for entities. So if you create a new entity type, this person was noticing we often use DC title for the name of every type of entity. So whether it's a project or a person or a publication or or a journal, all of those use DC title as the thing we're displaying as the name. And that seemed a little odd to this person asking the question, but the purpose behind doing that, which I answered here, is just to make things easier in the user interface. That way the user interface knows that for every entity, the name of this entity, whatever name means for that entity, will always be in DC title. And it doesn't need to go to different fields based on different entity types. It just makes it easier to display things in a common way using the same sort of search interfaces for everything and using the same view interfaces and edit interfaces. So often you will see with entities, they'll use DC fields, these generic fields, where a generic field makes sense, but where there's specific fields that no longer fall into DC, into Dublin Core, that is where you'll see more specific metadata schemas used. And so the example they gave here was that there's a funding stream field which has a more specific schema. You'll see the same thing on the person entity I noted. On the person entity, the DC title is actually the full person name, the name how you want it displayed, whether that's first and then last or last and then first. But it'll store the individual names. The first name goes in the given name field, and similarly, the last name has its own field as well. So it's just how we've chosen to structure things to make it easier to work with in the user interface. And not all these best practices are yet documented yet, simply because we're trying to figure out what these best practices are to some extent. Entities are still an advanced feature. We've kind of made this best practice for ourselves just to make it easier on ourselves, but there might be other ways we can achieve this. But right for now, DC fields are used where we can use them, and where we cannot use them, that's where you'll see custom schema. I think that was the last entities question on this particular page, and I see Holger's copying other questions in there at the bottom.
There is an
Holger,
entity
is there?
question in the Q&A chat.
Yeah, that's what
Piotr,
I was going to
first
ask.
one. Um, if the first one, if dc.title has not been used for an entity, what changes are required to show the entity other metadata such as, for example, combining first name and last name in the front end browse
That
search
is,
page? Yeah.
yeah, that's directly related to the thing I just answered. That's why we use DC title is because we have not figured out what areas are necessary to change in the front end, to be quite frank. So I don't know. However, I suspect you would need to modify the browse and search pages because they're all going to be assuming that you're using DC title. And I suspect you'd also need to modify the item page where the entity is displayed, because that will also assume that the DC title is the main name. But I don't know the answer off the top of my head. After this discussion later this week, I might have a chance to dig around and see if I can narrow that down better. But I suspect those areas all would need to be modified. And this is part of the reason why we really wanted to standardize on a field where that name exists, because I'm not sure those modifications are very easy if you have, say, 10 or 15 entity types. If you have 5, maybe it's not too bad and you can build code around that. But if you start to build more and more entity types into the system, it might get more and more complex as to how to make those modifications. But I need to dig in there and look around as to what exact changes would be necessary. Um, and I see there's another question at the top there now. Do I need separate relationships to show virtual metadata? That relates to entities to show virtual metadata for DC contributor author and DC contributor editor. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one off the top of my head. I should know it. I'm going to have to dig in there. I'm hesitant to say a yes or a no on that because I don't remember how the virtual metadata is linked up to fields. So I'm going to have to get back to that one, and I can answer that in the Google Doc later on. But I suspect it would be answered by looking at where the virtual metadata definitions are. I think there's an XML file, if I remember correctly, that defines those virtual metadata fields and links them up to what field they're displayed in. And so it might be a matter of looking at that XML file and determining whether that requires separate relationships or not to set those up. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. Looking around for other entities things. Okay, I'm not seeing other. No, that's the same question as again down further on near the bottom. Do you need separate relationships to show virtual metadata? So it's a duplicate. Let's go to some of the other questions then. I'm going to start. So that's everything I see on the entity side. Um, I'm going to quickly go through some more of the ones in the Google Doc, and then we should be able to get to everything here based on what's been asked so far. Still have a half an hour left. So I answered the first two. I wanted to note this one here. Can I skip attaching a license to an item? So this I'm assuming is that license that you have to always approve at the bottom of the submission form. Um, if that is the case, then it's possible to turn that license off. You can just turn off that license step in your submission form altogether, in which case it will never be asked for any item in the system, or you can turn it off individually, collection by collection, if you only want it asked for some collections. However, I did notice that if it's turned on, if that license step is on, then you can't skip it. It's always required. So the purpose of that step is to make sure that the repository, whoever's hosting the repository, has the rights to be able to accept your submission. So often that license will say things like, you grant us the rights to back up your file or whatever. Um, uh, in order to preserve it. It'll often be legalese, legal text related to that, but it's really giving the repository system the rights to do things with your content. So that's why it's required when it's on, but you can turn it off. Um, can I grant user metadata editing privileges to other users that are not the community and collection administrator? Right now, this is not possible in DSpace. You have to be a community or collection administrator to do this. So that's not something that is currently possible. However, you could add a request for this to our GitHub issues, but we'd have to find a volunteer interested in looking at how best to do this. Um, it might be possible in DSpace Chris, the system by Force Science, but that would be a situation of trying to find a way to backport that to DSpace. I'm not sure off the top of my head, though. I answered these entities questions. There's a couple questions here about how does DSpace relate to other repository systems. I wanted to say this up front. I'm not sure if the people who asked these are in this right now, but I would have to answer this in a very biased way because you're asking the DSpace tech lead and the DSpace program coordinator questions about how DSpace compares to other systems. So obviously we're going to be a little biased in that. But I did dig in slightly here, just look around briefly to see what Haiku's doing these days, because that's what was called out here. I don't know Haiku very well, but I do know that with DSpace 8, as I noted already, we're really concentrated on finding ways to integrate DSpace with external systems, allowing you to enter less data into DSpace. We already have a lot of ways in DSpace 7 to import metadata quickly from a ton of different systems. And as you saw from the brief screenshots and demos I gave, there's new ways in DSpace 8. I don't believe Haiku is at that space yet. I could be wrong. But there are a lot of similarities between what Haiku does and what DSpace does. DSpace also does have a lot more service providers right now than Haiku. But overall, I just recommend picking the solutions that's best for you. And I highly recommend picking one that's open source and preferably with a strong user community, as I noted here. And there's a similar question down here about digital commons, around how digital commons compares to DSpace. This is also difficult for me to answer. I'm not up to speed with everything Digital Commons does. However, I know that we have some similar features in DSpace, that Digital Commons has this idea of faculty profiles. DSpace now has researcher profiles. But one thing I wanted to call out here is that I know Digital Commons is hosted. So you may want to talk with some of our service providers who are people who will host DSpace on your behalf and see what they have that can make DSpace line up better with Digital Commons if it doesn't already. Because a lot of these service providers will provide plugins or extra features on top of vanilla DSpace if you host with them. And those extra features might be enough to be able to allow you to move to DSpace pretty cleanly from Digital Commons, even if there's things that are not in there in DSpace yet out of the box. So I'd recommend talking to them about that in more detail. Um, did I skip anything up here? No. Oh, there was two questions here around performance issues. One about several pages they noticed having performance issues in DSpace 7, I presume. I wanted to stress again that there were over 300 bug fixes in 7.6.2 and 8. There were a lot of performance improvements and code cleanup in those bug fixes. So we've made some pretty significant, excuse me, fixes both to the submission and my DSpace specifically in those releases. So I would recommend trying to upgrade. That said, I also want to be very transparent and clear that we are aware that there are some other performance related issues that people have encountered in DSpace 7. And likely those also exist in DSpace 8. We're working on many other performance-related tickets and investigating those, and this is a major topic in developer meetings. So if you're interested in those, you can join one of our developer meetings that happen weekly. We have developers that are very actively working on these, and some of those are further along than others, but I do suspect in those bug fix releases coming out, probably, like I said, later this year in a 7.6.3 and an 8.1, I suspect there will be more performance improvements coming soon for those issues that we're aware of. So first upgrade, then look at the existing issues. If you still don't see anything defined there about what you're seeing, ask on the list or create a new bug ticket because maybe it's something we haven't discovered yet. And we do have these performance tuning guideline docs I want to mention here in this area that are very useful for people to take a look at. And if you have tips that are not on those docs or you find those docs are not as useful as they could be, this is an area that I'd love feedback on. I'd love people contributing to. So get in touch or just add comments directly into that document. And I will take those in mind and try and move those up into the guidelines themselves. This next question is very similar. It's about someone encountering issues in the submission form. I'm not familiar with these specific issues, but similar to the previous question, we had a lot of fixes going into the submission process in my DSpace. So I'd recommend upgrading to see if it's already fixed. If it's not yet fixed, ask on the mailing list, use that troubleshooting guide if you need to find more details about the error if you don't have those details yet. And hopefully we can help you out there and figure out what's going on. But first and foremost, I would recommend upgrading because of those bug fixes. And I should mention, if you're already on 7.6 or 7.6.1, the upgrade to 7.6.2 should be pretty easy because it's a minor release. It's only bug fixes. So if you want to upgrade quickly, you might want to go to that 7.6.2 release quickly, and then in the future look towards going to 8. Those were all the answers from previously. So let me jumping around here a bit. I'm going to jump back to the Q&A now, Holger, here. And let's see what we can find here. So I'm going to just start at the top of the Q&A. Does publication claim feature consider affiliation? Can an author filter his items that are only affiliated by the current organization? The publication claim, I think, does naturally do that because of how things are structured in open air. I believe the search that it's doing might have an affiliation feature on there. I could be wrong on that though. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I believe I believe it's doing something related to your specific DSpace instance in terms of what those authors are. However, I cannot say with 100% certainty. So I'll answer this in more detail after the fact, but I believe there might be an affiliation relationship there with that through the OpenAir interface, OpenAir Graph REST API. Does the publication import function work for those publications which are legally required to accept manuscripts be deposited instead of the version of record? This is something I'm not sure I can answer because I'm not sure of the legal requirements here. Because of the legally required uh, wording, I'm not sure I understand the implication of this question. I might need more information on that. So if whoever asked that could either re-ask it in a different way, or you can add additional details into the Google Doc after this meeting is done. Maybe I can get you a better answer. But essentially, the publication import is often just grabbing metadata from an external system that has already had permission to publish that metadata in some way. So I believe it would be acceptable here, but I cannot say for certain. So that's all I can say on that one. Is it possible to link and match existing organist or ROR records? We already answered that, that I believe it's possible. Does duplicate detection also work for imports using the SWORD protocol? I believe it only would if that import goes into the workflow process. So as I mentioned, duplicate detection works in both the submission UI and the workflow UI. So if you're submitting from SWORD and that SWORD submission goes in and requires a workflow approval, then it would work. But if the SWORD submission goes directly into a deposit and doesn't go through workflow approval, then it's going to skip duplicate detection, because the only way to capture that duplicate detection is if there's a step there to be able to visually see whether it's a duplicate or visually check. So it depends on your scenario there. I need a Spanish translation here. Holger, do you know the Spanish
Yeah, so the
translation?
question is there an application to help with the migration of version 6 to version 7 and to 8?
I vaguely remember there being a tool that someone in Latin America created related to this. I will say first from the DSpace side, we just have the DSpace upgrade guide and the migration guide. So documentation is that tool. Um, but I vaguely remember talking to Michele Maniele at Lyrasis, and he mentioned that there was someone in Latin America who may have built some tool to help with this process. I will have to look at that after this meeting and see if I can find that again. Um, so that I can share that more broadly. But otherwise, the upgrade guide or the migration guide that I linked to in the slides is the best place to start. But I'll see what I can find after this meeting. Can anyone, for example, a non-technical repository manager, test pull requests, or is the intention that other developers test pull requests? Anyone can test pull requests as long as you're comfortable working with Docker. Some people who are non-technical are totally comfortable with running some Docker scripts, but some people are not. So the process that we've documented for testing pull requests requires that you install Docker Desktop on your machine. It can be installed even on a laptop. I have it running on a laptop. Um, but it does take a little bit of getting used to. So if you're willing to learn a little bit about Docker and walk through that process, then a non-technical person should be able to test pull requests. If you don't feel comfortable with Docker for whatever reason, then this probably isn't the best way for you to contribute, and maybe it'd be better to get involved with documentation or things of that nature. So that would be my answer there. A non-technical person can do it, but you have to have a slight bit of technical willingness to work with Docker. Is DSpace 8's database schema database model the same as DSpace 6? No, not entirely. It's similar. So the biggest change is between DSpace 6 and DSpace 7, to be clear. So DSpace 8 is very similar to DSpace 7. There are a few new tables, I believe, mostly related to those new integration features around OpenAir between DSpace 8 and DSpace 7. The bigger changes, though, are between DSpace 7 and DSpace 6. And that is because DSpace 7 added the new configurable entities. So there are some new tables related to configurable entities, but there are still a lot of similarities between the DSpace 6 schema and what you currently see in DSpace. We have not thrown away the schema entirely. There are a lot of similar tables and a lot of similar columns, but some things have moved around with the introduction of entities. So they're not going to all be identical. Um, Hi, are there any accessibility implementations? I'm not sure I understand the question, but I see accessibility. There's a lot of work going on with accessibility. I will note that there were a ton of accessibility fixes within both 7.6.2 and 8.0. So if you're running into accessibility issues or found some in DSpace 7.6 or any earlier version, or even 7.6.1, you might want to upgrade because we've been making accessibility improvements all the time. We do consider those bug fixes. So we also, as Holger mentioned, we have the development fund that's active right now on doing additional accessibility improvements. Those are being worked on right now, and some are already well in progress and in the review stage. Any of those accessibility improvements funded through the development fund, we're working to backport both to 8 and 7.6 because those are bug fixes. So as much as possible, they will always get backported to those prior releases. So hopefully that clarifies that a little bit. And if I didn't answer the question, you can ask it again as needed in a different way. Um, People are asking more questions all the time. This is awesome. Okay, so let's see. Can I copy a value of one field, for example, person last name, into another field like DC title upon item submission? That is a good question. Obviously, you could do that manually, but I know that's not what you mean. You're wanting to find an automated way to kind of duplicate that field. Um, the way I might consider doing that is via a curation task if they can run in the submission process, which I know has been worked on a little bit from one of our developers, Mark Wood, who I'll call out right here. I'm not sure if he's even in this meeting though, but he's been working on ways to enhance the curation tasks, which are little scripts that can run automatically behind the scenes. He's trying to get them running both in the submission process and in the workflow process. So when you're entering metadata or even uploading files, you can have an automated script running behind the scenes to do different automated changes, even things as simple as maybe um, it could be copying fields like this. Maybe you want to check the file format to make sure it's acceptable or check for viruses or things like that. But he's working on ways to improve that. That would be the way I'd think about. But this might be a good question to also ask on the mailing list to see if someone else has figured out a way to do this, because it's possible someone has a solution that I'm not even aware of. So that might be my recommendation there, but I'll see if I can think of anything else after the meeting as well. Next up, can I change URLs of items and bitstreams during the transition from version 6 to 7, or can changes in the URLs negatively affect the indexing level of the repository, such as presence on Google Scholar? It should not. So when you're upgrading from version 6 to version 7 or 8, you are correct that the URLs change. Some of the URLs are not the same. However, in DSpace 7 and also in 8, we made sure that any old URL structures that are in DSpace 6 automatically redirect to the new location. And this was built specifically for Google Scholar. So Google Scholar reached out to us when we were building DSpace 7 around the URL structures, and we had a good discussion with them about this. And they asked us to put in automatic redirects from all the old URLs in version 6 to ensure they go to the new location. And those redirects let the Google Scholar bots know where the content is now found. So there should be no impact here at all that I'm aware of. If you find some sort of impact, I would reach out to Google Scholar first because they're usually able to figure out what's going on. Maybe their indexer is doing something unexpected, or maybe you have a weird configuration there that they can give you a recommendation on. And then you could reach out to the mailing list as well and offer what you're seeing, and we could try and help you through that. I do want to note, as part of this question, I have relatively regular conversations with the Google Scholar team. By relatively regular, I mean, once a year, sometimes a little more frequently than that, depending on if they're finding issues. And they do reach out to me if they've found a lot of common issues across DSpace sites. So if you report something back to them, they know you're using DSpace, and they start to see a theme across several different DSpaces, they send that off to me. The Google Scholar team will send that off to me. I'll take a look at it, log a bug if we find a bug there. Otherwise, we'll have a discussion about how can we solve this better to make sure DSpace works well with Google Scholar. So that is a common thing that comes up a lot, but we do our best to kind of work through those problems quickly. And hopefully that answered the question pretty clearly. Next up, are there any plans for major minor releases that focused on theming? So I'm assuming on building new themes for DSpace 7 or 8. I will note the one thing that is somewhat related to this is there's the work that I mentioned earlier in the slides that DCAT is going to be starting up around user experience, which I consider related to theming because it is about making DSpace easier to interact with, and it's somewhat related to making the theme easier to use potentially, or at least from a user perspective, makes things clearer. I think there'll be feedback coming out of that that will be going into upcoming releases. So feedback about that user experience testing is definitely under consideration. I know that steering is aware of that and wants to make that part of 9.0 and possibly even backport things if there's things we can fix. In terms of building themes and creating themes, I'm not, I think I'd need more information about what you're looking for out of that, because we're often looking towards the community to make suggestions around what you need next. So if there is a gap that you see, maybe create a ticket about it, start a discussion on one of the developer lists if you're asking questions. I know that Holger also alluded to this briefly earlier on. We're hoping to try and do some more DSpace 8 training later this year. Maybe that will help with some of it as well. A webinar of some sort. It's not set in stone yet, but we're wanting to do something to that effect. So hopefully one of those can help out with what you're looking for. Someone in Brazil mentioned it. Open repositories 2024. Oh, that's probably related back to my comment about the Latin American tool for the upgrade process. Yeah, I thought that there's something going on that was mentioned at Open Repositories 2024. I believe there is a tool out there that can help people with upgrades from DSpace 6 to DSpace 7. However, I've never used the tool, and it might be specific to the needs in the Latin American community. But I would totally welcome folks taking a look at it. And I think someone may have just added the link to it at the bottom there. I just saw that pop up. Yep, there's a DSpace Updater tool link there, Holger, at the bottom. If we can capture that and maybe pull that into the Q&A uh, or into the document, the Word document is what I'm trying to say, the
Yep,
Google Doc.
yep.
And it looks like other people are linking to that. Thank you. Yes, several of these links here all relate to that. So I'm not crazy in my thinking that there's a tool that someone built. I will note I've never used it before, but I think it's awesome that they built this tool to help themselves and the rest of the community along. So I would recommend others trying it out. If it looks useful to you, reach out to the developers and help them out with that. If we find that many people are finding this very useful, maybe we could even pull it back into DSpace in some way into the code base, but we'd have to talk about that, I think, at the steering level and the developer level. But that's amazing that this tool exists. Okay, so next question here. We got 7 minutes left. If you were on 6.4, would you recommend upgrading to 7.6.2 or to 8.0? That is a really good question. I think I would base that on what features are you most interested in. I would look at the 8.0 release notes at the new features listed for 8.0, the specifically new features, and see if anything there jumps out to you as something you must have. If there's something in that 8.0 release notes that you must have, then that's the obvious answer there is you need to upgrade to 8.0. Um, excuse me, if there's nothing on there that is must have, uh, I might consider upgrading to 7.6.2 first because of the fact that 8.0 is so new. Simply put, I think I mean, we do testing of all these major releases, but I will note that the .0 releases, as many people know, can sometimes have undiscovered bugs if we missed a bug along the way, and if so, we'll rush out an 8.1. But that's the only thing that I would consider as well on the 7.6.2 side is that 7.6.2 is pretty hardened and stable to this point in time. It's gone through a couple bug fix releases. It's going to be a bit more stable, perhaps, or I don't want to use the word stable, I guess. It may be less obvious bugs in 7.6.2 than you might encounter in 8.0. That's not to say you will encounter a lot there with 8.0. But I'd use that sort of pro and con. 7.6.2 has gone through several bug fix releases, but if there's something you really need in 8, you might want to start that upgrade knowing that 8.1 is coming soon enough anyways. These next two links look like they're all linking to that updater tool from Open Repositories. Thank you very much for folks finding that for me, so I didn't have to dig around after the fact. Would it be possible to configure the handle as the primary URL of the item instead of using UUID? Um, I'm assuming by primary URL, you're probably meaning you want that URL to appear in the address bar of your web browser. So like up here as I'm clicking on my shared screen. Um, right now, it is not possible to have that appear in the address bar. The handle cannot appear there just because of the structure of URLs within DSpace 7 and DSpace 8. I know in DSpace 6 there was a slash handle path that would appear in the address bar browser. Those now redirect to the new locations in DSpace 7 and 8. And DSpace 7 and 8 are built off of the UUID. And part of that is actually a response to Google Scholar's feedback. So I talked to Google Scholar a lot. When we were building DSpace 7, Google Scholar gave me the feedback along the way that they really don't like those slash handle URLs because they cannot tell what's behind them. And they want to be able to filter things based on the URL structure. So they actually asked DSpace to make sure that we have slash item, slash collection, slash community, and even the entity types in the URL. So for an entity type of person, you'll see slash person. That is because Google Scholar asked for that. And they wanted those to be able to allow their bots to more easily identify what's in DSpace. And that's why the handle URL went away. The old ones will redirect, and you can still use handles. They will always redirect to the right location, but you just can't put it in the address bar right now with DSpace 7 and 8. So hopefully that makes sense. The next one is that updater tool that we've been talking about. And the slides up, all the links here next are the updater tool, which is awesome. So I think I've answered every single question here. We're with 3 minutes to go. And maybe that's the best 2 minutes to go. Maybe that's
Um,
the best time to wrap up then, Holger. Go ahead,
I did
unless you
I
were saying
did get
something.
one other question through Slack that someone sent
Sure.
me. So I'll just go ahead and read that here. The question was, can I add private bit streams to a public item and forbid access to them for the anonymous group, either from the item view or from the URL to the file?
Yes. Yes, that's always been a feature of DSpace for a long time. So you can definitely create private bit streams on a public item. And in fact, by default in DSpace 7 and 8, when you do that, the link will still appear to that public bit stream by default. So there'll be a link there, but it'll have a little lock icon next to it. If you click on that link, there's a way that you can request a copy and send a request back if you want to do that, but you can turn that link off if you want to and just um, or turn off that request to copy feature if you want to, and just make it totally access restricted. But yes, that is possible in DSpace 7 and 8, and even before that as well.
Okay, great.
Wow, we're right on time here. I was worried we were running behind a little bit, and then I guess I caught us up. Um,
Thank you, Tim.
Yes. Is there anything else you're seeing, Holger, that we want to do here before wrap up?
I don't see anything else. If anyone has additional questions, you can always feel free to email. You can send a question through Slack. You can also, I will turn the editing rights back on for the Google document, so you can add your
Yes.
questions there as well. Um, and yes, so thank you so much, everyone, for attending our webinar today. Thank you again to Roxana for the translation. And without any, yeah, if
Yeah.
there's nothing else, then we'll just wish everyone a good day and thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And thanks for all the great questions. Some of these I do have to dig back into a little bit, but I appreciate all the excellent questions. And have a great rest of your day.